Childhood and Society, Part 1. A new installment of Curriculum of Grace, a series of articles chronicling God's pursuit of a young man impervious to the teaching of elders. In the fall of 1968, Erikson was one of my intellectual heroes. I desperately wanted to take the course he offered in the auditorium of Harvard's Seaver Hall. So desperately that in spite of not being able to register, I showed up early for the first class to plead to be let in. I could think of no better start for my sophomore year at college than studying with the author of Childhood and Society, which examines how culture influences children's development. By now I had worked with children in several different roles and settings. As a tutor in a Boston suburb, as a big brother at a rural mental health center and in a Cambridge public housing project, as a game leader in a migrant labor camp, and as a mentor for a troubled seventh grader in an elite boarding school. Erikson's ideas, I hoped, would help me gain deeper understanding of how children's social environment shapes their learning and growth. More immediately, I sensed that they could help resolve an uncertainty I had felt bubbling up for a while now, an uncertainty I could not articulate then, but which I would now frame as the question, who was I becoming? The big auditorium was nearly empty when I arrived, but it filled quickly. I'd taken a seat near the front, giving me easy access to the professor so I could plead my case. 5 minutes after class started, I glanced back and saw the seats behind me were now full. New arrivals were gathering in the aisles. A few of the newcomers had even squeezed behind the last row of seats and were standing against the back wall. Finally, someone way too young to be Professor Erikson stood up and announced that anyone not registered had to leave before the lecture could start. Whoever wanted to be put on a waiting list for a seat should give their name, major, and class standing to a teaching assistant. Graduate students had top priority for open seats, then undergraduate upperclassmen majoring in psychology, then underclassmen with a psychology major, and so on. As a sophomore majoring in history and literature, my chances of getting into the course were slim to none. Even so, I gave one of the TAs my name, listened disconsolately to his warning about the number of people ahead of me on the priority list, and shouldered my way through the crowd out into the glare of the morning sunlight. That was as close as I ever got to hearing or seeing Erikson. It didn't dawn on me that yearning to take his course might be a clue I should consider changing my major. I didn't foresee that my vision of myself as a historian and literary scholar would last only a few more months, not even till the end of the current semester, or that my actual career would focus intensively on topics covered by the lectures I'd just been excluded from. What I took from the experience of that beautiful early fall morning was that I needed to stay in my lane and stick to the course I'd committed myself to for the indefinite future. At 19, my repertoire of strategies for defeating institutional obstacles was not highly developed. So far as I could see, Harvard's curricular barriers to learning about childhood and society were insurmountable. Fortunately for my young self, however, there was another curriculum that was more forgiving. I now call it the Curriculum of Grace, in recognition of God's loving intervention in the life of a staunch unbeliever. This alternative pathway to knowledge, vastly more powerful than anything Harvard ever provided, led me to another distinguished psychologist, Dr. Natalie Rogers. I worked with Dr. Rogers all year, even after I dropped out of Harvard. For an hour every week, I met with her in her office, not in a crowded auditorium, as would have been the case with Professor Erikson. What I heard from her were not the sonorous generalizations that echo through large lecture halls, but specific suggestions and questions about my meetings with a boy I'd worked with the previous summer, whom I'd volunteered to tutor during the school year. In the fall of 1968, as at every other time in my life, God knew what I needed better than I did. The work I did with this boy, what I learned from it, and how Dr. Rogers influenced me then and later in life, I will return to next week in the second half of this narrative. For this week, I close with a curious aftermath of that Monday morning debacle in Seaver Hall. Some years later, 43 to be exact, I interviewed for the position of dean at a Midwestern state university and was taken to lunch by the chair of one of the departments I would oversee, a man just a few years older than me. It turned out he'd been a graduate student at Harvard my sophomore year and was enrolled in Erikson's class, the one I couldn't get into. He was an intelligent man, an amusing lunch companion, well liked by students. But as it turned out, he hadn't adapted all that well to the responsibilities of adult life, particularly to those associated with his leadership role in the department. Soon after I became dean, he resigned his position as chair and I had to appoint someone else. He couldn't stomach my decision to fire a faculty member who, despite ample opportunities to reform, had behaved like a harridan in the classroom for several years and was showing signs of mental instability. I'm not sure being in Erikson's class benefited my new colleague as much as I thought it would me when I was 19. He did not seem as well equipped to be who he turned out to be as one might have expected going to a place like Harvard and studying under someone like Erikson. I, on the other hand, was not harmed by missing out in the class, desperately though I wanted to be in it. Sometimes being given what we think we need doesn't help us as much as we think it will. At age 19, I didn't know that, and I doubt I would have accepted it even if the ruler of the universe had told me so. As it turned out, he was in no hurry to try, but in his great wisdom and patience was contented to wait all these long years so I could discover it on my own.